So we've talked about what art is and what art history is. We've talked about the basic medium processes. Today we're going to talk about the basic vocabulary of art. And just as our language has vocabularies, art also has its own visual language and its own vocabulary. Elements of art, there are 10 main ones that you see here, and they're kind of like the basic words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs of art. Tomorrow we'll look at the 10 principles of art, which are more like the grammar, the tense, the punctuation. So we're going to go through each of these 10 and talk about what they are, and you should definitely know all these terms. We'll be using them throughout the term as we talk about specific artworks. So first is line. And line in geometry is an extension of a point, or the path of a moving point. In art, it is a mark made by a moving tool, such as a pencil or pen or paintbrush. And line, there's different types of lines you can see here. Vertical lines, horizontal lines, or diagonal lines. So vertical go up and down, horizontal left to right, diagonal on an angle. Each of the lines also imply different types of values and communicate different ideas. Vertical lines tend to communicate strength and stability and authority, like this building here, a Greek temple, or a bank often uses vertical lines to give a sense of reassurance and stability. Horizontal lines, like you see here, like the ocean, the boat, communicate calmness, peace, passiveness, restfulness. If you look at vacation brochures, they often use lots of horizontal lines. Now you have lying down on the beach, calm and serene. Then diagonal lines kind of do the opposite. They communicate the concept of movement and action and drama. Vertical and horizontal lines are sometimes called inactive lines, while diagonal lines are considered active lines because they tend to exert energy, action, movement, even instability. So you can see the the diagonal line of the person here conveys movement. In this painting, that I'm sure you all are familiar with, Leonardo's The Last Supper from the 15th century, we can see what type of lines does he mainly use in this work. If you don't look at anything else but just line, you might say horizontal lines tend to dominate. We have the dominant horizontal line of the table. The 12 apostles sit with Christ in the center. That's echoed by the horizontal line of the ceiling, and the coffers or the kind of sunken panels up in the ceiling are horizontal lines. The windows, horizontal lines. We have a slight angle here of the tapestries on the wall, but horizontal lines tend to dominate. We also have vertical ones as well over here in the walls, over here in the windows as well. So both these lines, vertical and horizontal, inactive lines, tend to convey a calmness, a sense of timelessness, and restfulness. Now if you take the exact same composition and the same subject matter, the Last Supper, and you turn the line of the main table on a diagonal like you see here in Tintoretto's painting, you can see this completely changes the kind of mood and what's being communicated here. In addition to lines, we have the use of light and dark as well. But in general, the line here conveys movement, tension, drama, by putting that on the angle like that. Types of lines, these are just some sampling. We talked about vertical and horizontal and diagonal. We also have different kind of traits of lines or different characteristics that lines can have. Zigzag line, curved lines, curly, spiral, thick lines, thin lines, shape, cross-hatching, angles, dots, scumbling. These are just a sampling of the different types of characteristics that lines can have. For your visual analysis project this week that's due on Friday, you're going to be choosing an artwork and look at line. Is line a dominant feature of the artwork, and what types of lines and what kind of lines are being communicated in that artwork? Connected to line is the term contour, and contour you can define as the outline or outer edge that defines a shape. So these are examples of contour drawing. Something you often do in an art class is to take an object and just draw the outline of it. As you can see on the left, an apple, and on the right, the human figure. If you look at this painting, we can see in addition to active and inactive lines, there's other types of lines such as straight or curved. Straight lines tend to kind of convey, again, sort of a static quality, formality, authority, while curved lines give the sense of action and agitation and instability and movement. You can see in this painting by Peter Paul Rubens, curved lines dominate. We have the curve of the crocodile, the curve of the figures, the curve of the knife. All these different curved lines, if you were to do a contour drawing of this, you would see almost all curved lines, which again convey and communicate action and drama and tension, which is very suitable for a hunting scene that we see here. In the familiar Nike icon or logo, look at the types of line that the graphic artist chose. We have a curved line and we have a diagonal line. So it's curve and diagonal. And what do these convey? What does Nike, the company, want us to, what are they trying to communicate with this type of logo? The kind of swoosh. Certainly it conveys action, energy, movement that goes along with athleticism. Lines can also be what we call actual lines or implied lines. Actual lines are the actual lines we see here, right, joined together. Implied lines are like these, connecting dots or dashes, or the types of lines and shapes that can be formed by connecting points. So in this painting, and this is something to think about when you go to the art museum and look at an artwork, is the artist using direct lines? Are they using implied lines, concrete lines, directional lines? And in this case, we have a kind of a combination of both implied lines and concrete lines that the artist is, actual lines that the artist is using. This is by Goya. It shows a scene of an basically execution of Spanish rebels. And look at just that line alone. We have the straight lines of their bayonets, the French troops' bayonets. We have a curved line that comes down here and kind of draws our eye to the main action that's happening in the almost center and off to the left here. Here you can see how the types of what we call directional or lines of force, and they are lines that direct our eyes to certain parts of a composition. So you have the slope of the line coming down from the hill, then you have kind of the line of the soldier's feet lined up here. Notice that they're perfectly straight in a line, while the rebels are collapsing, they're curved, they're disorganized. Then the line brings us around this way and back around, so it circles our eyes and attention to the center, most important figure, which is the man in white who's about to be executed. Second major element is shape. And shape is a two-dimensional area that is defined in some way. We have two main categories, geometric shapes and organic shapes. Geometric shapes are those that we see here. They're regular shapes, square, octagon, triangle, rectangle, circle. And then there's organic shapes. And organic shapes are more irregular and more connected to kind of nature and change and morphing from one state to another. Geometric shapes tend to be regular and they convey order and unity and timelessness, while organic shapes connect to spontaneity and change and living things. So in these two artworks, this is a small jade Chinese sculpture here of circles. They have it carved out in a circle and then a circle in the center, and this gives a sense of timelessness, something that goes round and round and never ends, and stability. Here in this Renaissance painting, the artist has actually used a circular canvas so that our eyes are constantly going to the center, the most important figure, Mary and Jesus. So the circle here helps direct our eyes to the center. So there's actual shapes, but there's also implied shapes, just like we saw with line. Implied shapes are shapes we can see where no continuous boundary exists. So just as line can be implied, so too can be shaped. So we kind of connect the dots here and we see a pentagon. Or we kind of connect the dashes here, the implied shape here, what looks like a peanut. Or we can see here the lines that connect together to make a triangle. In this logo, familiar AT&T logo, the artist has used horizontal lines, first of all, to convey kind of stability, right? And also we see the way that lines kind of go from thin to thick to make it look like a globe, right? So it looks like a sphere. And the lines here imply the globe, that this is this company is about communication, expansive telecommunication network all over the world. So this is a very effective type of logo to convey that. Third major element is form. And form, if in a 2D object is shape, which are flat, a 3D object is its form. So while a triangle may be a shape, a pyramid that we see here is its form. So it's an object defined by 3 dimensions. And like we saw with shape, there's also geometric form and organic form. Geometric form, like we see here, is based on geometric forms like cubes, discs, spheres, pyramids. Organic form, again, like we saw with shape, is connected more to nature, things that are organic or living, based on living things. And so in the human body, for example, is an organic 3-dimensional form. Fourth and fifth I kind of put together here because they're closely related. The fourth element is volume. And volume is the amount of space occupied by a 3-dimensional object, or the region of space or area an object takes up. Solid objects have volume, so do objects that enclose space. Okay, so volume is one term you should know. And then connected to it is what we would call mass. Mass is the actual physical bulk of a solid body of material. So volume and mass are sometimes important elements that an artist will use. For example, in this artwork, the artists were certainly playing with the ideas of open volume. In this case, we see this sculpture installation in a library in Illinois where we have all kinds of objects that are hung from wire. So we have this implied sense of volume here, right? And mass, in fact. It looks like a solid object, a human head, and yet you can see right through it. So this is what we call open volume. In this artwork by Olmec, or Mexican artist from 1500 BCE, we have large head, colossal head, made out of basalt, a type of rock. And this is the mass, right? The solid mass of an object, the physical bulk of the object here. In this case, it suggests solidity, imposing strength and heaviness. So these types of sculptures were used by the Olmec to intimidate and to overwhelm their enemy. Sixth element is texture. Texture, or the tactile quality, any object that can be touched or felt has texture to it. So if we were to run our hands across these two different vessels, we would feel different things. Run our hands across this one, we would feel something rough and coarse. If we ran a hand across this, we feel something smooth and glossy. So it's the tactile quality, how something feels if you were to touch it. And sometimes texture is an important element that the artist is focusing on. For example, this surrealist sculpture by Merritt Oppenheim, done in 1936, is playing with the idea of texture and kind of subverting what we would expect. We expect a teacup and spoon to be glossy and smooth to hold our tea in, and yet what she has done here is covered it with fur. So there's a sense of repulsion, a sort of unexpected sensation that's created by the fuzziness of the teacup and saucer. Texture also can be implied. So, for example, in this painting here by Ingres, 19th century painter, French painter, if we were to run our hands across the oil painting, it would feel smooth. But there's also a sense of implied types of textures. For example, the way he's painted it, we get a sense that if we were to, the skin of the woman would be smooth and soft, that the silk of the drapery behind her would be silky in her hands. We have the mixture of the feathered fan here that would feel kind of fluffy. We have the fur down here contrasted with the velvet of the cushion and the silk of the sheets. So he's playing with all kinds of implied textures that give a sense of kind of a sensory idea of the exotic. So artworks can have an actual touch how they feel and also an implied touch, tactile quality. Seventh element is value. Value is the degree of lightness or darkness of a surface, area, or color. In sculpture, like we see here, or in architecture, value results from real light, which creates shadows. So in a three-dimensional artwork, like we see here, shadows are cast, right? Because of a light source in the front that's cast shadows behind it, because the artwork has depth. This is part of its value. In two-dimensional art, like a drawing or a painting, value can be implied. Artists kind of blend light and dark shades to convey a sense of form and depth. So for example, an artist who's trying to convince us that this is a ball or a sphere chooses a light source over here to the left and creates a highlight where the light is hitting the surface first. And then gradually, as we move to the other side, we get darker, and then we have reflected light, and then a shadow being cast here. So these are all implied sense of value, light and darkness that the artist has created to convince us this is a three-dimensional object. Sometimes value is an important element in an artwork. In this artwork, the artist painting is using light, the contrast between light and dark, to convey both an expressive quality and sort of a symbolic one as well. We have Mary Magdalene here, the saint, repentant saint who is looking at a mirror, and the mirror is reflecting the skull. And you can see there's a candle, just the tip of the candle behind us. So we had a strong contrast between the light that's reflected on her face in the mirror, and then the darkness. 3/4 of the painting is plunged in darkness. So she's contemplating her own mortality. She's thinking about her death and thinking about eternal life that comes with the acceptance of Christ. So light and dark is used here in a spiritual way and in contrasting life and death. 8. Space is another element, and space is that which is characterized by dimensions of height, width, and depth. This can be seen in actual architecture or through illusions in painting. So space is the distance between identifiable points or planes. So we see there's space in between each of these columns of the Parthenon. If we go inside the Parthenon, this is the reconstruction of it. This is the space that's defined by the ceiling and the floor and the four walls around it. Different types of space that we'll be talking about in this course. These are two types you should know, called negative and positive space. So negative space is the empty space around an object, and the positive space is the actual space itself. So in this artwork, in this one on the left, the Cycladic sculpture, we see that the actual stone marble sculpture is the positive space that takes up, sort of like the mass, but also there's a shape that's created by the negative space around it. And that's something that the artist was probably thinking about in this one on the right. We had the actual man seated upon a chair playing a harp. But also notice that there's shapes that are created by the space around it. The space, the kind of triangle of the openness of the harp, which is echoed in the triangular shapes of his chair that is seated upon. So both positive space, the actual object, creates a form or shape, but also so does the space around it. Another type of space is what we call closed and open space. Closed space arranges the elements around a central axis. Its main aim is to kind of harmonize disparate aspects of the picture into a coherent whole. So in sculpture, closed space is sort of like a closed fist. There's no spaces, it's very self-contained. This artwork on the left is, I would say, a closed space sculpture. It's all very compact. It all clings to a central axis. There's no kind of cutouts or spaces in between. Everything is rather kind of solid. Oops. While this artwork, I would say, is more about open space. While we have the mass of the figure, the two figures, if you look through, there's cutouts, right? So we can see through it. There's openness, not only in between the arms and the legs here, but out here, her arm outstretched, his arm outstretched here. So closed space tends to be kind of autonomous. It sort of keeps to itself, compact. Open space tends to take the viewer into consideration and often tries to evoke emotion and reaction out of the viewer by allowing them into the space. Here you can see kind of this play on negative and positive space, open and closed space. So here's negative space is the outside around the chair, positive space is the actual chair itself. So this can happen in two-dimensional art as well, not just three-dimensional art. Here we have the frontal of a head, the positive space, and now we switch it, and now that becomes a negative space, and here's the picture altogether. So positive and negative space, open and closed space, special types of space to keep in mind when looking at art. Another thing related to space is implied space on a two-dimensional plane. So in drawing or in painting, we have different terms that you should know that connects to space. First is the picture plane, and this is the surface on which a picture is painted or drawn, the actual surface itself. And a picture is typically organized into three main grounds, right? The foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Creation of these grounds is done through using the concept of perspective. You should know the term perspective. We're going to be seeing quite a bit, talking about this quite a bit. It's a method of organizing forms in space to create the illusion of depth or three dimensions. So as we know, a flat two-dimensional object does not have depth, but artists often use different types of illusions and tricks to convince us that we are looking deep into space when truly we are not. Some of the different types of perspective that artists use are shown here. And this image is not too good, but I believe it's in your textbook, so you can check it out in your textbook in the starter kit. These are different types of perspective. One of them, as we see here, is overlapping, where one object covers up another. So we get a sense that the house here is closer than this one. Diminution is that objects that get smaller, right, are further back. We perceive them as being further back in space. So this house seems to be further back because it's smaller. Vertical perspective means kind of stack things vertically, so we get a sense that the house on top is further back than the one in the front. Same thing with diagonal perspective. Put it on a diagonal and one further on top of the other. Atmospheric perspective is the concept that things further away tend to be blurrier and often have kind of a hazy bluish purplish cast to them. So if you look into the mountains, often they look kind of bluish and gray color. But if you got close to them, they'd be back to being green or brown color covered with trees. So atmospheric perspective is a form of perspective that can kind of convinces us that things are further away because they're fuzzier and have bluish grayish tones to them. Other divergent, intuitive perspective, we'll talk about these a little bit later. I'm not going to spend time on those now. Linear perspective or one-point and two-point perspective, another important form of perspective that was developed during the Renaissance. The kind of odds that parallel lines of an object recede back at a rate to a single vanishing point. So again, we'll talk about linear perspective a little bit later here. In this artwork, you can see the artist has used different types of perspective to convince us that we're looking into a three-dimensional space when actually it is a flat space. We've got the use of kind of light and shadow that's being cast, value. We can see that the lines on the floor recede back to a single vanishing point. And if we were to kind of do a drawing of it, we can follow all the lines so they go right to almost to the center of the composition, the most important part of the composition, where the father holds the sword that the sons are swearing an oath to. So this is a very convincing artwork to give us the illusion of depth. In this artwork, the artist uses many different types of perspective we just talked about. You can see they use overlapping, so this figure covers up some of this one, so we get a sense that this one's closer to us and this one's further away. Vertical perspective, things that are further back or higher on the picture plane, we perceive as being further away. Here's diminution, the little figures here, and there's some even further back, so things that are smaller away, we perceive as being further away. The use of atmospheric perspective. Notice that the mountains back here have a bluish cast to them, a little bit fuzzy, so we understand them being as further away. All these types of perspective, and of course linear perspective. We follow the lines of the piazza, they recede to a single vanishing point, so convincing us that we're looking deep into space. The ninth element is color. And And color, I think we have a pretty good idea of what color is. Color is basically is derived from reflected light. We see color because light waves are reflected from objects to our eyes. And there's different types of terms that connect to color. Hue, H-U-E, is the actual color, the particular shade of a color. Like red is a hue. Saturation is another term. Degree of purity of a color, or the color at its most intense. Here we can see on the color wheel the three main types of color, and they are primary, the primary colors, which are yellow, blue, and red are the three primaries. These are pure colors that cannot be made by mixing other colors to make them. Then we have the secondary colors, and they are green, orange, and violet. And of course, the secondary colors are created by mixing primary colors together. And on the color wheel, you can see this very clearly. Blue and red mixed to make purple. Red and yellow mixed to make orange. Yellow and blue mixed to make green. Then in between the secondary and the primary color are what are called the tertiary colors. And these are a combination of primary and secondary colors adjacent to each other in the wheel. So tertiary orange is like a yellowish orange color. Tertiary between the orange and the red is an orangish red, etc. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy here, but complementary colors is another term that you should be familiar with. Here's the term up here. And complementary colors are opposite on the color wheel, and when they're put next to each other, they form a sharp contrast. So when you juxtapose colors together, complementary colors together, it provides a sharp contrast and tension, you could say. So the three complementary pairs are red and green, orange and blue, and yellow and purple. And if you look on a color wheel, you can see they're opposite of each other. So purple and yellow are complementary colors, blue and orange are complementary, red and green are complementary. Put them next to each other forms strong contrast. If you mix them together, it goes to a neutral gray. And advertisers, marketing use these, right, to jar us and grab our attention. Red and green, orange and blue, purple and yellow, these are often used to kind of grab our attention because they form such a strong contrast when placed next to each other. Artists think about these as well. In this landscape painting from the early part of the 20th century, we can see the artists used mainly complementary colors. We have red next to green, we have orange right next to blue here, and this gives us a sense of kind of this jarring, tension-filled sense, even a sense of agitation. Grabbing our attention. So I would say this is a landscape that's not very soothing in the way that it's being presented because the colors mainly are so contrasting to each other. Opposite of complementary colors are what we call analogous colors. And analogous colors are those colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. So in the Monet's painting, for example, the water lilies that we see here, blue and grays and purples and green tones are close together on the color wheel. See, right in this range, right around here. So they tend to be more soothing, not as jarring. They tend to be very harmonious. Colors can also have intrinsic qualities. Cool colors like blues and purples and browns, cooler tones, convey the sense of the ocean or the sky, cool qualities. Warmer colors like red and orange and yellow give a sense of warmth and heat, like the sun, like fire. Another characteristic that colors can have reflect mood, like blues tend to be kind of the blues, right, melancholia, while red and yellows tend to be about kind of happiness and cheerfulness, vibrancy. And one last characteristic of colors I want to talk about for now is another quality is that they tend to, colors tend to kind of convey a sense of depth. For example, reds and warmer colors like red and orange seem to advance. They seem to come towards at us, while cooler colors like blues and purples and grays seem to sink back. They recede back into space. So sometimes artists use this to also use color to help to convey depth. And finally, the last element we're going to talk about is time and motion. And we can see time and motion is exactly as it's described here. It's a sense of moving through time and chronology, action, and with modern art like video, here we have a light installation by Jenny Holzer. Time and motion are easy to convey. But even before modern and contemporary forms of art, time and motion could be conveyed through other means. For example, a particular type of time and motion is something called continuous narrative, and we'll see that quite a bit here. It's basically showing the same figure several times in one panel to convey a story or a narrative. So, for example, in this is a detail on the right of a structure, a kind of an altar that was for a Buddhist temple in Japan, and it shows Buddha 3 different times. He's up top here taking off his cloak, his drapery. He's jumping it down into the forest, and here he is again down the bottom being eaten by a tiger. So he's sacrificing his own body to save a starving tigress, and that is part of his nature of being kind and benevolent and self-sacrificing. So we're not meant to understand that there's 3 different Buddhas. We're meant to understand that this is the same person showing 3 different stages in a story. We'll see a lot of artists in ancient art using continuous narrative to give a sense of chronology. And there's other types of motion that can be conveyed as well, even if you have a static object like a sculpture here. Notice what the artist has done here to convey motion. We have the sense of a wind blowing their drapery and their hair, this strong diagonal that sweeps upward that gives a sense of motion here. Notice this is a very open sculpture. We can look through it, and that also conveys motion and movement through time. So those are the 10 elements.